When Baron Theodore Whitmore's lawyer opened the sealed envelope on that cold January morning in 1861, everyone in the room fell silent. What they were about to discover would shake the foundations of Charleston society and change dozens of lives forever. Greetings, friends. Today I want to share with you a story that still echoes through the corridors of American history. It's about Baron Theodore Whitmore, a man who lived two completely separate lives for over 3 decades. I really hope this narrative touches you the way it touched me when I first learned about it. Now, before we begin, I want to be completely transparent with you. This story is not 100% real. The names and specific characters you'll hear are fictional. However, what makes this crucial to understand is that everything they experience was based on actual frequent occurrences during the slavery period in the United States. These weren't isolated incidents. They were documented patterns found in plantation records, wills, court testimonies, and historical archives from the antebellum South. The characters may be invented, but the truth of their experiences, and particularly the complex situations involving mixed-race children born into slavery, is absolutely real and extensively documented. But to understand the magnitude of what happened when that envelope was opened, we need to go back to the spring of 1831, to Whitmore Hall, one of the largest plantations in South Carolina. Theodore Whitmore inherited the plantation when he was only 25 years old, after his father's sudden death from yellow fever. The property stretched across 5,000 acres of fertile land, with over 300 enslaved people working the cotton fields. Young Theodore had been educated at Harvard, spoke 3 languages, and was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in Charleston high society. In the fall of 1832, he married Margaret Ashford, the daughter of a prominent Virginia tobacco merchant. Their wedding was the social event of the season, attended by governors, senators, and the cream of Southern aristocracy. Margaret was beautiful, refined, and everything a plantation mistress was expected to be. She managed the big house with grace, hosted elaborate parties, and played the piano beautifully. But Theodore Whitmore was not the gentleman he appeared to be. Within months of his wedding, he began visiting the slave quarters at night. His first victim was a young woman named Sarah, barely 17 years old, who worked in the kitchen. She had no power to refuse him. No one did. When Sarah became pregnant, she was quietly moved to work in the fields, away from the main house where Margaret might notice. This was only the beginning. Over the next 3 decades, Theodore Whitmore would father children with more than 20 different enslaved women on his plantation. Some of these women were forced only once. Others endured his attention repeatedly over years. He showed no remorse, no hesitation. To him, these women were property, and he believed he had every right to do as he pleased. The enslaved community knew what was happening. They whispered about it in the quarters after dark. Mothers tried desperately to hide their daughters when they reached a certain age, but the plantation was Theodore's kingdom, and escape was nearly impossible. The overseer, a cruel man named Jacob Merchant, ensured that no one spoke of the Baron's nighttime visits. Anyone who dared complain or resist faced the whip or worse. By 1845, there were at least 15 children on the plantation who bore Theodore's features. Some had his distinctive green eyes, others had his high cheekbones and narrow nose. The resemblance was so obvious that visitors sometimes made uncomfortable jokes about it, but no one ever challenged Theodore directly. In the antebellum South, such matters were considered private, even when they were happening on a massive scale. Margaret knew, how could she not? But she had been raised in a society that taught women to look away from such things, to maintain dignity through silence. She focused on her own children, 3 legitimate sons born between 1833 and 1839, William, Charles, and Robert. She poured all her love and attention into raising them to be proper Southern gentlemen, while pretending not to see the mixed-race children who worked in the fields and served in the house. What happened next is something that I found particularly striking when I researched this case. In 1850, Theodore made a decision that would seem incomprehensible to many. He began keeping detailed records. In a leather journal hidden in his private study, he wrote down the name of every enslaved woman he had forced himself upon, and every child born from those encounters. He noted dates, physical characteristics, and even personality traits. Some historians believe this obsessive documentation reflected a growing internal conflict, though he never stopped his abusive behavior. By 1860, as tensions between North and South reached a breaking point, Theodore Whitmore's secret family had grown to at least 40 children. 40. Some were now adults themselves, working in the fields or serving in the big house. Others were still children, playing in the dust of the slave quarters. They ranged in age from newborns to men and women in their late 20s. That year, Theodore turned 54. His health had begun to decline. He suffered from terrible headaches and shortness of breath. His physician warned him that his heart was weak, that he needed to reduce stress and live more carefully. But Theodore had other concerns on his mind. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. War was coming, everyone knew it. And Theodore Whitmore began to think about mortality, about legacy, about what would happen to his empire when he was gone. On a cold night in January 1861, Theodore sat in his study with his lawyer Edmund Price, a trusted confidant who had served the Whitmore family for decades. What Theodore asked him to do that night was unprecedented. "I want you to draft a new will," Theodore said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "And I want you to promise me that it will only be opened after my death, in the presence of all parties concerned." Edmund Price had known about Theodore's other children for years. Everyone in Charleston's legal circles whispered about such arrangements, though they were rarely formalized. But what Theodore proposed that night went far beyond the usual provisions. "I want to free them," Theodore said, "all of them. Every single one of my blood children who was born into slavery." Price stared at him in shock. "Theodore, do you understand what you're saying? That's 40 people, maybe more." 43, Theodore corrected. He had counted. He knew each name. But Theodore's plan went even further. Not only did he want to grant freedom to his enslaved children, he wanted to divide his estate among all his children equally. The 3 legitimate white sons would inherit alongside the 43 children born to enslaved women. Each child would receive an equal share of land, property, and money. Edmund Price tried to dissuade him. "Your legitimate sons will contest this. Margaret will be devastated. Society will crucify your memory." Theodore's response was chilling in its honesty. "I don't care about my memory, but I've been thinking about judgment, Edmund, about standing before God and accounting for my actions. I can't undo what I've done to those women. I can't give them back their innocence or their years, but I can give their children freedom and a chance at life." The will was drafted over 3 weeks. It was meticulous, naming each of the 43 enslaved children by name, identifying their mothers, and specifying exactly what each would receive. Theodore also included provisions for education, stating that funds should be set aside to ensure all his children, regardless of their race, could learn to read and write. He signed the document on February 10, 1861. He made Edmund Price swear on the Bible that the will would remain sealed until after his death, and that it would be read in the presence of all named heirs. Then Theodore locked the will away and never spoke of it again. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. Theodore's legitimate sons immediately enlisted in the Confederate Army. William and Charles were commissioned as officers. Robert, the youngest at 22, joined a cavalry regiment. Theodore himself tried to continue managing the plantation, but his health deteriorated rapidly. The stress of war, combined with his heart condition, was too much. On the morning of November 3, 1861, one of the house slaves found him collapsed in his study. He had suffered a massive stroke. He died 2 hours later, unable to speak, with Margaret holding his hand. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by hundreds of mourners. Confederate officers gave eulogies praising Theodore's contributions to Southern society. Margaret wore black and maintained perfect composure. The legitimate sons came home on emergency leave to bury their father. 3 days after the funeral, Edmund Price requested a meeting with the family. He arrived at Whitmore Hall carrying a leather case. Margaret received him in the parlor, her sons standing behind her chair. "Mrs. Whitmore," Edmund began carefully, Your husband left specific instructions regarding his will. He requested that it be read in the presence of all his heirs. Of course, Margaret said. We're all here. Edmund Price took a deep breath. Not all of them, ma'am. According to the will, there are 46 heirs in total. The room went silent. Margaret's face turned white. What are you saying? I'm saying, ma'am, that your husband acknowledged 43 other children, and he's left instructions that they must all be present for the reading of the will. What followed was chaos. William shouted that this was impossible, that his father would never do such a thing. Charles demanded to see the document immediately. Margaret simply sat frozen, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. But Edmund Price was bound by law and by the oath he had sworn to Theodore. Over the next 2 days, he quietly spread word through the plantation. All of Theodore's children by enslaved women were to gather in the big house on November 10th. When that day arrived, the scene was surreal. In the grand parlor where Margaret had once hosted tea parties and balls, 43 people of color stood nervously, many of them bearing obvious resemblance to the man whose portrait hung above the fireplace. The youngest was an infant, held in her mother's trembling arms. The oldest was a woman named Clara, who was 29 and had worked in the fields her entire life. Margaret and her 3 sons sat on one side of the room. The 43 others stood on the other side. The division was literal and symbolic. Edmund Price opened the sealed envelope and began to read. The will started with a confession. Theodore acknowledged that he had committed grave sins, that he had used his power to exploit women who had no ability to refuse him. He stated that he could not make amends for the suffering he had caused, but he could try to provide for the innocent children born from his actions. Then came the bombshell. Every single one of his children, legitimate or not, would inherit an equal share of his estate. William jumped to his feet. This is insane. Those are slaves. They can't inherit property. But Edmund Price continued reading. Theodore had also granted immediate freedom to all 43 of his enslaved children and their mothers. Furthermore, he had established a trust fund to pay for their education and to provide them with resources to build new lives. The Whitmore plantation, worth an estimated $800,000 in 1861, was to be divided into 46 equal shares. Each child would receive approximately $17,000 worth of property, land, or money. For the legitimate sons, who had expected to inherit everything, this was a catastrophic blow. For the enslaved children who had expected nothing but continued bondage, it was incomprehensible. Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper. He knew all along, and he never said a word to me. But the will wasn't finished. Theodore had included one final provision. His 3 legitimate sons would only receive their inheritance if they agreed to respect the freedom and rights of their half-siblings. If they contested the will or attempted to re-enslave any of Theodore's freed children, they would be completely disinherited, and their shares would be distributed among the others. It was a brilliant legal maneuver. Theodore had essentially forced his legitimate sons to choose between their inheritance and their pride. The next weeks were tumultuous. William and Charles wanted to fight the will in court, but their lawyers advised them it was airtight. Theodore had been of sound mind when he drafted it, and Edmund Price had multiple witnesses to verify this. More importantly, contesting it would mean losing everything. Meanwhile, the freed children faced their own challenges. Freedom was one thing, but building a life in the middle of a civil war was another. The Confederacy didn't recognize Theodore's emancipation, and there were real dangers for free black people in the South. This is where the story takes a turn that left me speechless when I first learned about it. Clara, the oldest of Theodore's enslaved children, took charge. She was literate, having been secretly taught to read by a sympathetic overseer's wife years earlier. She understood that staying in South Carolina was dangerous. Clara organized a mass exodus. Using money from the trust fund, she arranged for transportation north. Over the course of 6 months, she helped more than 30 of her half-siblings escape to Pennsylvania and New York. Some of the mothers came too, finally free after decades of bondage. The journey was perilous. They traveled at night, following routes used by the Underground Railroad. Confederate patrols were everywhere, and being caught would mean certain death or re-enslavement. But Clara was determined. "Our father gave us freedom," she reportedly told her siblings. Now we have to fight to keep it. Not all of Theodore's freed children left the South. Some, particularly the younger ones, stayed with their mothers who were too afraid to travel. A few even remained at Whitmore Hall working as paid servants under an agreement with Margaret, who found herself managing a plantation with almost no labor force. The Civil War raged on. William Whitmore died at Gettysburg in 1863. Charles survived the war but lost an arm at Petersburg. Robert was captured and spent 2 years in a Union prison camp. When the war finally ended in 1865, the Confederacy was destroyed and slavery was abolished throughout the United States. Theodore's will, which had seemed so radical in 1861, was now simply a precursor to what the 13th Amendment would accomplish on a national scale. But here's the truly surprising part. The freed Whitmore children thrived. Clara used her inheritance to open a school for black children in Philadelphia. Several of her brothers started successful businesses. 2 became prominent ministers. 1 became a doctor. Meanwhile, the legitimate Whitmore sons struggled. Charles drank himself to death by 1870. Robert tried to maintain the plantation but failed. The land was eventually sold to pay debts. The Grand Whitmore Hall fell into disrepair and was demolished in 1889. By 1900, the descendants of Theodore Whitmore's enslaved children were teachers, business owners, and community leaders across the northern United States. The descendants of his legitimate white sons had faded into obscurity, their wealth and status gone. Margaret Whitmore lived until 1892, dying at age 81 in a small cottage in Charleston, supported by a pension from the Episcopal Church. In her final years, she reportedly told her pastor that Theodore's will was perhaps the only honest thing he ever did. Now let me share with you why this story matters so deeply, even though the specific names and details are fictionalized. What you've just heard represents a pattern that was extensively documented throughout the antebellum South. Historical records, including wills, plantation inventories, and census data, show that enslaved women were systematically abused by white slaveholders and that thousands of mixed-race children were born into bondage. The particular situation of masters acknowledging these children in their wills actually happened more often than many people realize. Historians at the University of Virginia and Duke University have studied hundreds of such cases from plantation records across South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Louisiana between 1800 and 1865. Some slaveholders did attempt to free their enslaved children and provide for them, though the legal and social barriers were enormous. What makes these situations particularly tragic is that even when freedom was granted, the children and their mothers had already suffered years or decades of exploitation. Freedom couldn't erase that trauma or restore what had been stolen from them. And during the Civil War period, the chaos made such emancipations extremely dangerous to execute. The strength of people like the character Clara in this story, those who took the fragile gift of freedom and built meaningful lives despite overwhelming obstacles, is documented in countless slave narratives and historical testimonies. The transition from slavery to freedom was never simple or easy, but thousands of people accomplished it with courage and determination that still inspires us today. This narrative reminds us that slavery wasn't just an economic system. It was a structure of power that allowed exploitation, abuse, and the destruction of families on a massive scale. It also reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, people found ways to survive, to resist, and ultimately to build futures for themselves and their children. I hope this story has moved you and given you something to think about. These aren't just distant historical facts. These are human stories of suffering, resilience, and the complicated legacy of America's original sin. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Does your family have stories from this period of American history? Have similar accounts been passed down through your generations? Please share them in the comments below. I believe these stories need to be told and remembered. And please tell me where you're watching from today. Which city, which state, or which country are you joining us from? I love knowing that this community spans the whole world. If this narrative resonated with you, please leave your like on this video. It helps more people discover these important stories. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new historical narrative. Thank you so much for being here today, for listening, and for caring about these stories. Sending a warm embrace to each of you wherever you are. Until the next story, take care.